Hello. This paper is called A Piece of the Ethnic Pie, and this paper examines emerging culinary customs, its enclaves of intercultural negotiations, as a space where social inclusions and exclusions can be challenged, and alternate claims for self-representation, rights, and justice can be articulated. In focus is the new phenomena of ethnic food festivals occurring in Guwahati, the provincial capital of the state of Assam in India. This is examined in the context of historical relationships between the caste Hindu and ethnic minority populations of the region. Guwahati is an emerging Asian metropolis in a region that has been marred by decades of internal armed conflicts. Assam is located in the northeast borderland region of India, a cultural as well as geographic category, for a long time considered as a marginal and frontier conflict zone. In history and memory of India, and even the world, the region has remained a conflict periphery, often seen through highly orientalized perspectives. Ethnic festivals are never neutral in scope, I guess, and they have never been politically neutral in the Northeast especially. However, these kind of new food festivals have provided an alternate space, quite different from usual festivals that has been predominant. Here, a fluid social transaction and practice can breach food taboos and generate new tastes, identities, exclusions, inclusions, conceptions of selfhood, and spaces of liminality. New claims and self-representations can be articulated in this space, in otherwise what has been a violent history of marginality. These phenomena also reflect the changing relationships between the caste Hindu population of India and the tribal populations. The northeast populations in this grand narrative of India has been historically kept out of this sacred space. They occupy a more profane and inferior space in this narrative. Such a discourse has historical roots and has been accentuated through colonial policies and language. What is remarkable is the persistence of the tribalist discourse that has continued in the post-colonial social world. William Mazzarella talks about auto-orientalism, which is a reproduction of an exotic trope through the process of self-stigmatization, and that revitalizes colonial and other such imageries. Often these go on to facilitate the process of creating an aesthetic community and a cultural identity. So as we can see here, the tribal motifs are very popular as a marketing strategy now. So far, the way the narratives from the Northeast has been imagined had been not free of stereotypical descriptions. The traditional narratives have been dominated by conflict, backwardness, development, and so on. But today we see a historical shift in these narratives towards tourism, cultural identity production, and other transnational linkages to Asia and so on. While there is this outward thrust in connected with global histories, there is also a parallel crystallizing of narrow identities and group identities and claims. For instance, the stress on tribal symbolism in festival or restaurant spaces to mark a community's distinctiveness is an instance of this. What remains to be seen is how the region manages to grapple with all these changes that are happening today, and within the tropes of such imageries that one can see. At the same time, there are hybrid ways in which ethnic and other minorities are able to claim spaces that were not available to them before. There are also new and creative ways in which the region expresses cultural identity formation and productions that move away from traditional forms of mobilization that were overtly political and often violent. With the thawing of violence in many parts of the region, colonial legacies such as ethnicity and tribalism are being fashioned into a heritage. And this heritage is transformed into an ethno-commodity. And here I've used the idea of an ethno-commodity as used by the Komarovs in their book. And one can see the construction of an ethnic cuisine as part of this process as well. Colonial inheritances have shaped modern ethno-identity claims and movements. For instance, even the concept of an ethnic Assamese or tribal rights and tribes and identities. Colonial cartographies has produced so many groups and tribal locations such as homelands and fixing of people into certain locations, for instance. So many of these markers of distinction today are borrowed from colonial imagery. For instance, the use of the term Mongoloid, which is a colonial term as well, but today it is internalized and used as part of a process that describes an ethnic community or a larger ethnic collective, and then that is used in these festivals as a marketing gimmick. Such distinction markers may sometimes be actually useful to transcend marginality imposed by the majority group, and Frederick Barth has written on this, writes that a boundary is that defines the group, but not the cultural stuff that encloses it. He writes on how a minority ethnic group can choose to emphasize their ethnicity and use it in order to develop novel niches in sectoral organization in the mainstream frameworks. But at the same time, this can result in a reification of social and identity-based boundaries as well as claims. There are novel ways in which the region is experiencing a process of minority identity formation, which are fused with modern festivals in such a way that they occupy a new social and symbolic space and are mainstreamed into the mainstream consumptive patterns. This could provide a space for ethnic minority populations to challenge marginality. There are multiple modes of redefining such a heritage, and this is in consonance with larger socio-political realities that reflect the neoliberal transformations as well. There's an active agency of many actors and entrepreneurs who are at the heart of this process of creating and redefining a city's culinary heritage, and forming hybrid amalgamations that these new actors carry into these spaces of liminality, and this provides a scope for making alternate claims as well. The hybrid forms of production often allow for spaces of two contest dominant modes of being and practice. In academia, heritage is a hybrid process and is recognized as such, and it is a process that is authenticated by the negotiated forms of authority and expertise. Thus, we see a possibility of new alliances emerging between entrepreneurs and civil society actors, trying to wrest the expertise to authenticate and redefine what can be considered a changing culinary heritage scape. In the context of ethnic food festivals in Guwahati, which serve as liminal spaces, where traditional taboos and practices such as drinking of country liquor in public, which is otherwise illegal and taboo, are temporarily dismantled. The important point here is that through this hybrid form of presentation, ethnic minorities of Assam are able to carve a niche space for themselves, even if it is still a contentious and mediated one. Restaurant entrepreneurs like self-made chef Otul Lankar, who was one of the pioneers to introduce this discourse of ethnic Assamese cuisine in the city, has, for instance, spiraled into the discourse of ethnic minority socio-political claims. Ethnicity is fused with that of cuisine and is presented in festival spaces as a commodity for popular consumption. In addition to this, there seems to be an interesting claim to what constitutes the heritage of Assamese cuisine. One of the first and probably the only few upscale restaurants for a long time till more recently that offered traditional Assamese cuisine was introduced by the Paradise group of restaurants in Guwahati. Even after long years in operation, they remain traditional in the sense that the Assamese cuisine they serve is that which is characteristic of caste Hindu Assamese and excludes tribal or non-Hindu items like pork. Paradise's proprietors belong to a well-known Brahmin family from Upper Assam, and despite being a lot of money to be made by having pork on the menu, they still resist serving pork. Instead, they serve a parampara thali, a tradition platter literally, that constitutes an assortment of various caste Hindu Assamese food items such as fish preparations, various poultry including pigeon meat, which is a delicacy in the region. With this thali, they also seek to authenticate what a traditional Assamese platter should look like. In Hindu social thought, food and markers of act as markers of exclusivity and rank. For an upper caste person like a Brahmin, for instance, eating vegetarian food could be a matter of exclusivity and his status, ritual status. The northeast region does not conform to such Hinduized norms in general. However, even in Assam, even the purest Brahmin would eat both fish and meat, but not pork, because pork is seen as inferior and impure. It is not popular among caste Hindu populations to eat pork, and this is something associated with tribal societies mostly. And this is governed by ideas of purity, impurity, and the culinary habits are linked to status and a degree of civilization. So by this logic, some tribal groups for who instance eat pork are ranked low because of that. But today we see that new restaurant entrepreneurs like Lahankar, who introduce Assamese thalis that serve pork in his restaurant, and has thus redefined the notion of an Assamese platter. His first restaurant, Korika, literally meaning skewer, a bamboo skewer, which is also now a symbol of the popular consumption patterns in these ethnic festivals. He introduced these kind of recipes in his and involving pork in Assamese cuisine. To validate the claim to being an authentic Assamese cuisine, Korika is now recommended by the internationally acclaimed travel guide Lonely Planet on its website. One has to be wary of the disproportionate power of travel guides to certify and authenticate cultural heritage, but this nonetheless ends up mainstreaming certain trends. As if taking his claim even further, Lahankar has recently opened a new restaurant called Heritage Korika in the city. In this paper, I have chosen to focus on urban ethnic festivals because of their marked difference from the way they operated in the past. In these festivals, many groups are served the same food, yet they claim different tribal banners for the cuisine. So this is a space of contestation to claim certain kind of cuisine for themselves and cement their place in public imagination. So recalling Barth again, we see how communities shape their own identities based on a premise of difference from others. Historically speaking, in the 1920s and to the 40s, ideas about distinctiveness of tribal culture had come into being as separate from the Hindu Assamese. And the discourse of tribal identity and tribal movements began at that point. And today we see the tribal communities asserting their difference still, though incorporating food and cuisine as part of their constructed genealogy, along with using traditional markers of nationhood like language, which was the main vehicle earlier. In a liminal setting like ethnic food festivals, certain aspects of tribal culinary culture, which may be otherwise hidden from the majority populations, can find a safe space to come to the fore. Customers sit in the stalls and eat insects and skewers of pork, fish and crabs, snails and fried silkworms, and drink the rice beer, which is country liquor, and all of these foods are taboo. In a country like India, where public drinking is not acceptable, here we have free-flowing sale of liquor. Such habits are subject to prejudice under normal conditions. However, indulgence in such activities in this kind of an ethnic festival setting is somehow acceptable. And flaunting tribalness here becomes a mark of distinction, where we see the malleability of tribal identities and how they can operate in different spaces. Participation here may not have an inclusive agenda necessarily, as a tribalist discourse is not necessarily integrative, and is rather based on a more market-based rationale. Nonetheless, the entrepreneurial initiatives have made space for alternate community claims to manifest. There is also a process of redefining what is the notion of who or what is an Assamese. At the same time, such processes may be negated by counter-narratives that can be based on specific and narrow identity assertions and claims, for instance claiming constitutional benefits like affirmative action. Borrowing from comparative studies elsewhere, for instance in Eritrea, We see emergence of festivals as a place where identities can be crystallized and formed, or can be manifest. Bihu is the harvest festival around Assam, the quintessential harvest festival. And today in Bihu, in the Bihu festivals, we see the presence of ethnic food stalls as well, which is again a new phenomena. And here we see what is being redefined as what constitutes the space of Assamese. The idea of an ethnic Assamese, in fact, is something very new. It's from the 1990s, that comes from the nationalist movement as well, the separatist movement that emerged at that point of time. But to give more examples, a momoghar, which is a small roadside eatery selling this particular dumpling, a street food called momo, which became a craze at some point in the city when it was introduced. It's an import, a Tibetan/Nepalese import that has come into the city, but nonetheless it has achieved transformations of taste of the people. Many people took to eating pork after being introduced through this particular dumpling. Momoghar claims to sell ethnic Assamese momos. Now there is nothing ethnic or Assamese about a momo. But however, momoghar has been part of the culinary heritage discourse, because certain groups that, like Metropolis, that were organizing a big festival, and they were doing a heritage drive around the city. They, under a banner of an urban story, basically, and this project put momoghar as part of its promotionals as well as part of the project, which means that momoghar has somehow made it into the modern urban culinary heritage discourse. So these kind of new spaces have emerged in the city's imagination. In popular parlance, ethnic food has come to mean normally the food of the Mongoloid or East Asian looking populations, tribal populations. However, today we also find Adivasi, which is a tribal group from descendants of the tea workers from the British era. They look a bit different from the other tribals, and they are more marginalized within tribal communities by virtue of them being a smaller group. Their presence in these festivals is quite remarkable and quite significant, because their history is marked by a lot of violence and marginalization, even by other ethnic tribal groups. And given this context, it becomes important for the questions of multicultural discourses in the city. The food consumed by all these communities are similar owing to the ecology. Fish and pork are central to the diet. And what we see is that the Adivasis have chosen to also sell the same food as the other tribal populations. So in this case, we see that they have adopted to the narrative of the other tribals in making claims for themselves and space for themselves. In Zilka Jane's words, what we eat is related not only to who we are, but also what we want to be. In a metaphorical allusion to Kipling, the Ballad of the East and the West, when two people from the ends of the earth meet, although over skewers of pork and cups of rice beer, they do seem to have a lot to talk about. But does this conversation always have to take place in constructed, mediated settings of an ethnic enclave, or can it move beyond into the everyday public imagination? Thank you so much. That is the end of my presentation. Hello. This paper is called Piece of the Ethnic Pie.